So we have an international interview for you today, and we are focusing on Juliette's latest release with TwistIT Press, and this is Confess, which is the untold story of I'm going to say Juliette Good then. Confess, the untold story of Dorothy Good. So we're going to learn all about this and the witch trials in very soon. But first, I would like to introduce our guest this evening. So firstly, Juliette, could you tell us a little bit about you as a writer and just introduce yourself for us?
Sure. So I'm an author and an artist. I live in Wales now, but I'm an expat. I just moved here from the United States last year. And poetry is something that I came to later in my writing life. And I've always been very interested in history. And so the intersection of poetry and history just sort of collided for me and led me to create Confess.
Amazing. I think that's something that's really interesting about your work as well, and I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but the research and the history that's woven in is something that, you know, you can learn while you're reading, so a bonus. And Renee, would you like to tell us a little bit about Twist in Time and also you as a publisher and how it started?
So TwistIT Press originally started as the magazine Twist in Time, and it was because as a writer I mostly focus on historical fiction or historical poetry, and I found that there really wasn't that much of a market for that type of writing, which I found disheartening because there was so much for other writers who wrote about more contemporary kind of works. So I kind of wanted to create a safe haven for writers who kind of write the other. So I also created TwistIT Press, and it's like, the way I'd like to describe it is it's a press that gives a voice to writers of marginalized content. So the writers that kind of fall in the cracks, so those who write historical, and even some that kind of write in the fantasy realm that don't really get much appreciation, even though their writing is just as phenomenal. There just aren't that many outlets for it. And that's really just what I kind of focus on. I look for things that are different and very important and that have greater meaning than just what's on the page. And obviously, Juliette van der Molen gave me such an incredible piece of words. What are words? Gave me such an incredible manuscript to read and dive into, and I fell in love with it. So.
When you initially chose to publish Confess, what was it that excited you about it?
Ironically enough, my sister and I had actually just recently, I think we got your manuscript beforehand. We were doing the Salem witch trials. We had already done the research for it, and Juliette sent this to us about Dorothy Good, someone that, like, in our own research we didn't find a lot of information about. And so, like, this poor 4-year-old girl was a victim of one of the most horrifying and darkest times in American history. And the fact that someone like that could fall between the cracks was just so heartbreaking. So we wanted to help Juliette give Dorothy a voice. So we wanted to shed light on that history that shouldn't be forgotten and bring it forward and kind of show it in a new light and how things back then can still happen now. Perhaps not hangings, hopefully, but still hope. But that type of persecution is still something that is very much real today.
Absolutely. And so for you, Juliette, when you were writing it, how was it that it came about? And I guess this focus on Dorothy, because we hear a lot about the witch trials in America. And I guess, how did you even find Dorothy?
Actually, I found out about Dorothy through another podcast. It was Unobscured by Aaron Mahnke, who is also the creator of Lore. And in Unobscured, he likes to take a season and just do a really deep dive. So all of the episodes in the first season were about the Salem witch trials. And of course, growing up in America, I had learned a lot about them. But this was a really deep dive into that history, what was going on politically and socially at the time. And in one of the episodes, they talk about Sarah Good, who is Dorothy's mother, and she's sort of really well known as one of the first people who was arrested and accused. But then they just sort of mentioned, oh, and by the way, her daughter, who was 4 years old, was also arrested along with her. And they didn't say much about it. I don't think, not because they didn't want to give Dorothy space, but there really just isn't much information out there other than the fact that it happened, that there was an arrest warrant. And from hearing that, I don't know, it was like a 2-minute clip, I just thought, I want to see if I can find out more about her. And then whatever we don't know about her, it kind of set me on a course to imagining what that circumstance would have been like, and what the repercussions of that would have been for someone if they had to live their life basically knowing that they had, you know, confessed that their mother was a witch even when they were just a child and probably didn't know what they were doing, and the trauma and the fallout from that. So I kind of wanted to see what I could find about Dorothy, and then just think about what her life could have been like.
Definitely, and I think that's the great thing about writing historical poetry, that where there aren't facts, you know, there's emotion and there's creative interpretation, and you can bring to life that character and that person, which you have done. I've got the book actually, I'll show everyone. So what I wanted to ask both of you actually is how this manuscript changed over the editing process, because there's always parts of a manuscript that you choose to take out and develop. I think that can be really interesting in historical poetry because you're towing the line between keeping the facts in and changing it creatively as well.
I'll go first. Juliette, I was very fortunate in the fact that she gave me a very clean manuscript. The very minimal changes that were made were more grammar or syntax or anything to do with that. And I think the only thing we really discussed was maybe like a verse or two in terms of word choice. But other than that, from the moment we got it to its conclusion of being published, the manuscript stayed the same. That's actually a first for me. But she made it very easy, and I very much appreciated that.
It wasn't so easy for me.
Sorry.
That's okay. I mean, that's part of it, right? I think for me, it was like, so I did want to deliver as clean a manuscript as possible, and one that had a clear kind of focus and direction in how I wanted to tell her story. And I think the hard part for me was there were definitely poems that I wrote that didn't make it into the manuscript. And there's always this sort of difficulty in balancing like the facts and the creative license and wanting to tell the truth as it happened, but that being a very complicated concept too. And there was some poetry where I wanted to sort of come up with a story of what happened to Dorothy after the witch trials and sort of like lay out this kind of fictionalized life for her. But I really didn't feel comfortable doing that as I wrote the poems. I just felt like I was using too much creative license. And so I wanted to stick closer to the facts, but still I left some poems in there that kind of say like, okay, well, maybe when she was a teenager and she was trying to figure out kind of what had happened, she might feel this way about herself or that way about herself in context to the bigger picture. But I was really careful to try and be as, I don't know, as true to Dorothy as I could without knowing very much.
But did you feel a sense of responsibility when you were telling Dorothy's tale? And also, how did you find yourself accountable to that truthful telling of events?
Well, you know, even in the research, even amongst historians, like the historians disagree all the time. And so sometimes it's hard to parse what's real, what's not real, and then you can kind of look at all the evidence, I suppose. It's kind of like being a detective. You kind of put it together and you figure out, like, well, this makes the most logical sense to me, or if this was a mystery that I was going to solve, I would be more inclined to think this based on the evidence that I have. I'm very aware that anything that I write about, whether it's historical fiction or historical poetry, I'm very aware that my perspective will necessarily cloud whatever the facts are, maybe, because I'm looking back, and everyone says that, hindsight is 20/20, but it's always got that layer of our own present on top of it. And so I don't think that that's true at all, actually. So I felt a huge responsibility to try and, I guess in the beginning of the book, I kind of try to say, like, this is told from my perspective, and I want people to remember that. I don't want anyone to take what I say as this is gospel or this is fact. I think it's important that we think about these things really critically. And there's a poem in the book called Anne's Apology, and we also included the text of her actual apology as it was recorded. And so I thought, I read Anne's apology when I was doing research, and I was really annoyed by it. And I just felt like it wasn't enough, but I don't think anything would ever be enough. And so the poem that I wrote about it was extremely emotionally charged, and you can tell what my bias is in that poem, but I didn't feel that I wanted to apologize for it, ironically. So we put the text of her apology in there because I kind of wanted to say, okay, this is kind of my take on the apology, but here's the actual historical document, so you can look at that and maybe you can draw your own conclusions from it.
Definitely. And I think also in the back of the book, which is unusual with poetry collections, but obviously is apt for this, we've got a really extensive biography list. So I don't know if you can see here, but this is not even the full amount. But obviously this reflects a lot of research that you've done, Juliette. So I wondered, when you are writing, and I think a lot of people are interested in the writing process, how did you divide that into research and writing, and what was the split in terms of how much time did it take to do both?
Well, I started working on the book, gosh, I don't even know. It was like well over a year before it was published, when I was still in the United States. So some of the research took place there, and then more of the research took place here in Wales. It is very easy for me to fall into research and not come back out. I just am fascinated by it, and the more that I dig, the more I want to kind of unearth. And so what will happen is I'll read a fantastic nonfiction book for research, and then I go to the bibliography in the back because I want to grab the resources that that author used, kind of as a gut check too, because I know I'm getting the author's perspective, but also because I just want to know more. As far as how the time was split, I spent a lot of time at Gladstone's library in Hardin. And that is a library that you can't take the books out from, so you have to use them there. And so I would spend like an entire day just reading and making notes. And, I had this kind of like document that was like poem ideas. So I would throw in, something there. And then I would kind of go home and sit with that, because it was a lot to take in, and sort of do some free associating writing. But I would say that the research and the writing was probably pretty equally split, because some of those books too were written in such a way that they're really old texts, so they were kind of hard to make my way through, and I had to really concentrate. But there was a lot of research that went into that, and I don't know, I like it almost as much as I like writing the poetry, so so it was no issue.
That's brilliant. And I wondered, I think we touched on this before as well, Renee, when we were hoping that no one would get hanged in today's society. But we have an author note, obviously, in the book from Juliette. And Juliette, you're wondering if there'll be more victims in relation to victims such as Dorothy Good. And that dogmatic ruling of groupthink and whether we can fall into that in today. So do you think that there is an issue of that in society at the moment, and is that a danger that we could fall into?
Oh, do you want me to answer that? Sorry. I think it's a huge issue, and it's interesting that we're recording this right now at the time of the U.S. presidential election is tomorrow. And
yes.
I mean, it's groupthink, or it's what I've read about in sociology, especially recently, is a lot of tribalism. So kind of being with your group of people where you have your opinions sort of formed and you're in that silo. And so all of the information and the opinions that you're getting it's like an echo chamber. They're just repeating back to you what you want to hear. And so I think that is something that if you look at where we're at right now, things are really polarized. And anytime something is really polarized and you don't have a lot of, I guess, sort of more moderate in between type of thinking, you end up with that kind of tribalism or groupthink, and it can really quickly spiral out of control. So I do think it's something that continues to happen, and definitely continued to happen after Salem, and it's something that we should be aware of.
Just the world, if you take a look at history, for thousands of years, the world has always chosen to persecute someone, regardless of the culture or the religion or geography. There's always something. And it's a very disheartening kind of thing to think about, especially as you would think society continues to evolve. But we still regress to the same forms of fear and hatred. And I think it's something that can always happen again. And I think it's also because people don't, it's like, I think part of it is people don't learn from the past. And instead of trying to understand something that they fear, they simply ostracize it, count it as other, and things can just continue evolving from there. And it's just very, very sad. And when Juliette used the, as someone in the States, the election and just how everything is polarizing, I live in a place that is very divided. It didn't used to be. It actually leaned one way completely. And now it's when we have someone in power that people no longer like or now choose to like, wherever people fall, it's interesting to see where loyalties get divided amongst family themselves and friends. So it doesn't matter if it's someone you don't know. It could very well be someone who is a community member, who is a family member. And so history continues.
And I guess that when we're looking at groupthink and dogmatic ruling, you know, and you've got family members who believe a certain way, or, you know, whether modern day or Salem, then, you know, how are you going to challenge them? I guess that's what happened in the witchcraft trials, you know, that someone had one idea and it escalated, and then all of a sudden, are we going to challenge the person that's in power, or are we not? And, you know, are we going to challenge people's views of the person in power, or are we not? We're going to accept it. And I guess that's the slippery slope that history does not learn from.
Yeah, and I think it's really important in the context of Salem to remember that, you know, Puritan settlers came over to the United States for their religious freedom, and they really believed that they were being directed by God. And I mean, they themselves were victims of persecution. And when they come over and then suddenly things aren't going quite the way that they planned, a lot of unexpected type of things, like indigenous people that are not happy that they're taking their land or, you know, settling on it, or they have crops that are failing, and they have all of these kinds of things that are happening. And you know, what is their option? Their option is to say, like, because they believe in a God that's going to protect them, you know, they've got to find a reason that all of these things are happening. So I think sometimes in what Renee was talking about and being fearful, and then in also wanting to find a reason for things, to understand things, how do you solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is? So sometimes we rush to decide what the problem is, and then people say, especially people in power will say, hey, you know, we can fix that for you. It'll be okay. You just have to follow us. And that's a really powerful tool. And fear can make people do a lot of things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And it definitely contributed to what happened in Salem.
Absolutely.
Definitely. I think fear is a very powerful thing. It's what maybe all humans are governed by. It's a very complicated one. But at the moment, obviously, we are kind of living in a state of fear with COVID. So I wondered, Juliette, if at the moment you feel inspired and if you're working on new projects, or if you're sort of falling into despair like I am a little bit at the moment.
Every day is different. I would say that I always have something kind of on the back burner, and when I have my good days where I'm feeling a bit more hopeful, or when I really need the distraction, which is a lot, then I can dig into those projects. And I find that being creative, it's not a matter of feeling productive for me. It's a matter of feeling like there's something that I can make, there's something that I can do in a world where I don't control very much, and I have to kind of accept that. I have been working on another historical manuscript about Mary, Queen of Scots, and it is just poems away from being finished.
Amazing.
And yeah, and even though like Mary, Queen of Scots has been, she's been written about extensively, and we know a lot about her, it's been really interesting to sort of dig into that history and again, get some of the conflicting viewpoints, think about what life might have been like for her. And I think what I didn't realize, and I mean, I knew it because I read it, but she was so young. And I think I look at my kids that are now like around the age that she was, and I think, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine. So yeah, I've been working on that, and I'm working on a lot of visual art and painting right now. So keeping busy.
And just something which occurred to me just then, I know that you do a lot of artwork, Juliette, and when you're doing your painting, is that ever going to come into the writing or a collaborative work?
I think that it will somehow. It feels like everything is at some point intersects. And I was, before I started writing poetry, I was just constantly painting, and I was in my art studio and I didn't write anything. And then I sort of went, you know, the pendulum swung pretty wide, and then I was writing all the time. And now I'm sort of finding a balance between the two. But recently I had a poem published and a piece of art in Feral in issue 4, and it was the first time I had written an ekphrastic about my own artwork. So that was an interesting experience, and I definitely want to try to do some more of that. And I've also done some paintings from historical perspective that TwistIT Time actually published in their last issue, and it's been really interesting to think about. Sometimes the words are so hard, you know, and being able to paint something and apply emotion with color or with perspective, like vantage point, can either lead me into being able to write about it, or sometimes from the writing I can end up with a painting. So it's interesting to see how they're both kind of playing off of each other right now. And I don't know where it's headed, but I'm interested to find out.
Maybe it will emerge organically, like you were saying, that you'll have a stage whereby you can't do one without the other, and then you'll have a collaborative book.
I feel like if I tried really hard to make it work, it wouldn't work. So I kind of, at some point, have to stand back and say, okay, let's just do what feels right, and then watch it grow kind of organically.
So I'm excited for that. I've prompted it now. It has to happen, Juliette. And something which we have to do, Juliette, because I feel like readers will now know a lot about what's in Confess, but of course the thing that they don't know is what the poetry is like. So do you have either a favourite poem or just a poem that you'd like to share with us today to give people a bit of a feel?
It's really hard to choose a poem to read from this.
Do if one is too difficult.
No. I think the poem that I really want to read is this poem called Devil's Issue, because it really is about what we assume, what we expect. Like if we know that a person lives in a certain part of town, or they have a certain type of job or a certain amount of education, you know, how things can become like self-fulfilling prophecies. So I'll read that one. Devil's Issue. A monster, a kicker, moaner and complainer, how could she be expected to be anything more than the daughter of a mother everyone deplores? Sharp, slick pearls gnashing from a jaw intent on pulling skin through teeth, a little terror possessed. They, looking down noses pointed to heaven, where all that are clean and just reside. She marks them scarlet, tiny teeth impressions, chomps down until they cry. Dorothy, the serpent, writhing in the dusty dirt, her wild eyes fixed on each girl in turn as they fall, tumbling and mumbling, screeching into skies, shouting down choirs, calling on angels to cradle them in wings under the grace of an invisible God. Satan's seed, cursed, birthed from a tainted womb, kicking and wailing, unwanted into the world. How could she be expected to be anything more than a devil's issue, rotten to the core?
Oh, so moving. And, you know, like you said, that how can she expect to be anything more when she's told she is Satan's seed? You know, that's the most extreme, that, you know, that she's unwanted, she's evil.
Yeah.
So you become what you're told you are.
Exactly.
And Renee, can you tell us if people have liked what Juliette has been saying about the book and what we've been discussing, and if they would like to buy a copy, which of course they should, because it is excellent. So where should they get it from?
Oh, wow, there are several places. So they can get it directly through my website, which is twistintimemag.com. They can get it through Amazon in the US, the UK, and Australia. They can also get autographed copies straight through Juliette on her website, which I do believe is julietwrites.com, unless I'm lying. No, she's nodding. We're good. I do believe it's on IndieBound, on Waterstones, almost anywhere, honestly, you can purchase books. It's there. The only thing you can't get anywhere else is the ebooks. Those are purchased directly through my website. So it's literally TwistItTimemag.com and the shop link, and you can just pick whatever format you want. There's PDF, EPUB, and Mobi. So
amazing. That's all they're going to need. Absolutely everything. Excellent. And it's been really interesting hearing about that. And also I feel like it's just such a topical book right now. So it's very interesting to think about how the group mob thinking in this time links to now. So thank you for this evening's discussions, and we shall see how the election goes. By the time this has been uploaded, the election will have happened, and we'll all be able to laugh about it.
Hopefully.
If not, I'm coming to visit when COVID is done.
Do you want to stay?
If I'm welcomed.
Always welcome, always.
Oh,
Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
thank you.